Alright, today we are looking at some of the most common mistakes made in the apologetics and counter-apologetics sphere, as well as just internet philosophy and religion debates more generally. Now, it's no surprise that there are lots of mistakes out there in the steaming pile of poo that is internet debates about religion, but you'd be surprised at how much we can learn from reflecting on and correcting these mistakes, and that's the topic of this series. In the previous episode, we covered mistakes relating to probability, evidence, arguments, methodology, behavior, and the nature of philosophy. In today's episode, we're looking at mistakes about how to understand theism, atheism, naturalism, and agnosticism. We've got some painful ones today, so brace yourself. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode in this series. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and as I said at the outset, today we're in part 2 of an epic series covering common mistakes about philosophy and religion. Check out the playlist, which will eventually house the full 7-part series of videos, should be popping up in the corner up here. I already covered some important preliminaries in part 1 of this series, so let's just jump right into the mistakes. Oh, and be sure to check out the resource document in the description. Now, because we had 54 mistakes in the first part of the series, we will continue with mistake number 55. Atheism entails materialism, reductionism, nihilism, etc. Atheism, at least in a philosophical context, is the thesis that no gods exist. This clearly doesn't entail materialism, which is the view that everything is material. Of course, one could be an atheist and a reductive or non-reductive physicalist, where physicalism means that everything is physical. What the distinction is between material and physical is a little bit nebulous. Here I'm just going to treat them interchangeably for the sake of simplicity. Anyway. Of course, one could be an atheist. This is my point. One could be an atheist and a reductive or non-reductive physicalist. But atheism itself clearly doesn't preclude there being non-physical or non-material realities. Those realities simply can't be the theistic God. But they might be any number of other non-physical or non-material realities. For example, non-physical mental properties, or non-physical minds, or etc. One can be an atheist panpsychist and think that consciousness is fundamental and pervasive. One can be an atheist and a property dualist. One can be an atheist and a substance dualist, like maybe souls emerge from physical goings-on, or maybe they're just fundamental denizens of reality that get paired up with physical systems once those systems become sufficiently complex and powerful, as in Michael Huemer's view, etc. Heck, one can even be an atheist and an idealist, so long as apparently physical objects are either collections of mental qualities without themselves residing in a fundamental mind, or if they do reside in a fundamental mind, so long as that fundamental mind isn't God. One could even be an atheist and believe in ghosts, goblins, ghouls, demons, angels, crystal healing powers, spells, witches, and all that stuff. Atheism merely requires denying God's existence. It does not require denying the existence of these magical or spiritual realities. Far too often I see people conflate atheism with materialism. They'll say atheism entails that we're just materialistic robots or things like that. No, it doesn't. Please stop. Atheism also clearly doesn't entail reductionism, right? Reductionism is the project of exhaustively explaining absolutely everything about reality in the terms that, say, physicists would use. So ultimately, every going on, every object, every event is nothing over and above the interactions of fundamental particles or fields or what have you. And atheism does not entail that sort of reductionistic view of reality. An atheist could be a non-reductive materialist. They could think that some goings-on in the world are not exhaustively explained in terms of the goings-on of physics and physical vocabulary. An atheist could even be an Aristotelian and believe in natural teleology, that there are certain built-in ends or aims in nature, certain objective functions in nature. One can be an atheist and believe in substance-level or agent-level causal powers that aren't reducible to the powers of the substance's or agent's basic atomic constituents, and so on. And finally, atheism doesn't entail nihilism, the view that there's no meaning in life. For starters, clearly atheism allows for subjective meaning in the sense of meaning derived from one's goals, desires, beliefs, intentions, projects, pursuits, and whatnot. Atheism also allows for objective meaning. For example, perhaps there's something in the very nature of virtue and knowledge and love and so on that explains why their pursuit is meaningful. Even if we fail to realize or appreciate their value and meaning, they're valuable and meaningful in and of themselves by their very nature. Even if you don't accept this view, it's clearly compatible with atheism. Nothing in atheism rules it out. And so it's just false to say that atheism entails nihilism. It just doesn't. Get over it. Alright, mistake number 56. Naturalism is incompatible with the existence of abstract objects, or with Platonism. Okay, so, whether this is mistaken turns on what we mean by naturalism. Unfortunately, there are different understandings of naturalism in the literature. Here are two that you should be aware of. First is Graham Oppy's. Now, according to Graham Oppe's naturalism, natural reality exhausts causal reality. What that means is that every causal entity and causal property is natural, where natural causal entities and properties are those recognized in ideal, completed, true science. More precisely, and summarized by some bozo, 5 important and characteristic claims of Oppe's naturalism are as follows. First, as we've seen, natural reality exhausts causal reality. The only causal entities and causal properties that there are natural causal entities and natural causal properties, which are those recognized in ideal, completed, true science. See Oppe's book Naturalism and Religion, as well as his debate book with Kenny Pierce, published with Routledge, for a more precise spelling out of Oppe's naturalism here. But anyway, this is just a brief summary. Secondly, mindedness is late and local. Minded beings are either relatively recently evolved organisms or products of such organisms. Third, nothing is divine. Nothing causal is divine, or sacred, or worthy of worship. Fourth is shared history. Necessarily, any possible way that causal reality could be shares an initial history, that is, an initial world segment, with actual causal reality. In other words, for any possible causal reality, its history at some point coincides with actual history. And finally, chance divergence. Necessarily, the only way that possible causal histories diverge or branch from actual causal history is through objectively chancy events. Notice that this sort of view is perfectly compatible with the existence of abstract objects and with Platonism specifically. Here, I mean the contemporary analytic version of Platonism, according to which there are non-spatiotemporal, necessarily existent, non-causal abstract objects. That is, abstract objects which lack the power to cause things. These sorts of Platonists will believe in things like mathematical objects, so things like sets, numbers, functions. They'll also sometimes believe in propositions, which are the meanings of declarative sentences, the fundamental bearers of truth and falsity, etc. They'll also often believe in things like properties or universals as abstract objects, so like the abstract property of redness itself, or blueness itself, or triangularity as a kind of general or universal property that multiple distinct particular things can instantiate, etc. But anyway, my point is just that Oppe's naturalism here is clearly compatible with the existence of these sorts of abstract objects. Oppe is literally only making claims about causal reality. He's only making claims about things with causal powers. He's saying anything that has causal powers is going to be a natural entity. That claim is perfectly compatible with there being non-causal entities, that is, entities which lack causal power, such as abstract objects. So there is a clear sense in which naturalism is entirely, perfectly compatible with the existence of abstract objects. For instance, Graham Oppe's naturalism is perfectly compatible with it. His naturalism makes claims solely about causal reality, about concrete reality, in other words. The same is true with Paul Draper's version of naturalism. This is another version of naturalism I think you guys should be aware of. According to Paul Draper's version of naturalism, the physical exists, and if the mental exists, the mental depends on the physical. Notice that this is totally compatible with the existence of abstract objects. Merely saying the physical exists, and if the mental exists, the mental depends on the physical, is perfectly compatible with saying that there are also non-physical, non-mental, abstract objects like numbers, sets, functions, properties or universals, propositions, laws of logic. I know some people are thinking, well, like, what is the physical? And I just suggest people who are interested in that, this is going to be in the resource document linked in the description. I just say we could follow Jessica Wilson on characterizing the physical. Physicalists usually characterize the physical by reference to 2 components. First, the physical entities and physical properties are those entities and properties treated by or studied by or postulated by fundamental physics, with the proviso that, 2, physical entities and properties are not fundamentally mental. That is, they do not individually possess or bestow mentality. So check out this paper if you're interested. It's a really excellent paper. Also, by the way, notice at this juncture that atheism is not naturalism, okay? As I explained earlier, one can be an atheist and believe in supernatural entities like nature spirits, ancestor spirits, ghosts, demons, angels, chakras, etc. All one needs to be an atheist is to disbelieve in a very particular kind of supernatural being, namely gods. Naturalism is one way of being an atheist, but an atheist can be a non-naturalist, okay? They can even be a supernaturalist, in the sense that they believe in supernatural entities like the ones I just mentioned. And finally, under mistake number 56, I want to cover some helpful notes that Felipe makes with respect to a tripartite distinction among kinds of naturalists. As Felipe writes, there are several versions of naturalism. Naturalists generally share in common the view that the natural world is all there is. There is no supernatural realm of spiritual beings. However, naturalists differ in how they define the natural world. Now, there are at least 3 broad ways of characterizing the natural world, and so there are at least 3 kinds of naturalists. Let's call them conservatives, moderates, and liberals. Those dirty liberals, right? Conservative naturalists are straight physicalists. Nothing exists but the physical, and the physical is characterized by all and only the properties listed in physics and chemistry textbooks, and perhaps biology textbooks as well. Recent proponents include Andrew Melnick, Paul and Patricia Churchland, and some of the members of the so-called New Atheist movement. Moderate naturalists differ from conservative naturalists in that they expand their conception of the natural world so as to include abstract objects, for example, propositions, properties, possible worlds, etc. Recent proponents include Tyler Birch, Jeff King, W.V.O. Quine, and Kit Fine. Finally, liberal naturalists differ from moderates and conservatives in that they admit into their ontology, that is, their list of things that they think exist, they admit into their ontology of the natural world, the abstracta of the moderates, but they also allow for a conception of concreta according to which they have more properties and powers than the conservatives and moderates allow. Thus, perhaps they're straight Spinozists, or type F monists, or pan-protopsychists, etc. Famous past liberal naturalists include people like Spinoza. More recent liberal naturalists include Donald Davidson, Thomas Nagel, David Chalmers, Daniel Stoljar, and Felipe Leon himself. That's what I add here. Right? Thomas Nagel thinks the natural world is imbued with teleology, certain objective functions or goals or aims or ends. There's a kind of built-in directedness into reality. David Chalmers, who thinks that certain qualities of consciousness or phenomenal qualities are fundamental. Since liberal forms of naturalism are no doubt the least familiar, perhaps it'll be helpful to sketch one such account. David Chalmers' version of contemporary liberal naturalism is representative, so I will sketch his version, call it CLN. According to CLN, the world of concrete objects is composed of just one kind of substance, and its essence has both physical and phenomenological, or proto-phenomenal, or at least representational or proto-representational attributes. So this is not the sort of view that you'd get from a hard-nosed physicalist, right? This is saying that fundamentally there's just one kind of substance, and it essentially has both physical and mental properties, or at least properties that are like mental properties and have the disposition to give rise to mental properties. That's basically what a proto-phenomenal property is. So anyway, my point in all this is that you need to be very careful when you hear the word naturalism, when you think about naturalism, etc. You need to understand that there are different kinds of naturalism. They say different things. They're compatible with different things. Some are very conservative, as Felipe Leon said. They're like hard-nosed physicalists and need perhaps even reductionistic. Some are more moderate. They allow for abstract objects. They allow for non-reductive physical entities. They might allow even for emergent non-physical properties that are still nevertheless dependent on more fundamental physical properties. And finally, there are even liberal naturalistic views, which allow for even fundamental mental properties. So just be incredibly careful whenever you make claims about what quote-unquote naturalism implies, or if you have refuted quote-unquote naturalism, or if you hear an argument for or against quote-unquote naturalism. Always be sure to clarify what you mean by that, and when you come across someone else making claims about naturalism, ask them to clarify what they mean by it. And always keep in mind that an argument against one version of naturalism may not be an argument against different versions of naturalism. So the guiding line here is just to be careful, cautious, clear, and precise. And, of course, remember that naturalism need not be incompatible with the existence of abstract objects or with Platonism. Alright, mistake number 57, overlooking the difficulties that abstracta pose for theism when running abstracta-based arguments for theism. So oftentimes people will say, hey, there are these things called abstract objects, there are propositions out there are numbers out there are functions and sets, there are all these necessarily existent non-spatiotemporal objects, and some people try to argue that the best or perhaps only explanation for how there could be such things is that they are ideas or concepts in the mind of a necessarily existent infinite intellect. But oftentimes when people run this sort of argument, they entirely overlook the difficulties that abstracta may pose for theism. If you want to see more on this, you can check out my God and Abstract Objects playlist, and especially my video with Dr. Felipe Leon in there. But very briefly, most of the challenges revolve around the aseity sovereignty doctrine, that God doesn't depend on anything for God's existence or character, and moreover, everything distinct from God is owed or due to God's creative control. At least traditionally, theists have wanted to ascribe these sorts of things to God, and moreover, they seem to be perfections. But if there really is this infinite landscape of necessarily existent abstract objects, God seems to have no control over it. For classical theists specifically, there are distinctive problems. Right? If there are abstracta, well, then there are going to have to be necessarily existent things or positive ontological items, certain bits of reality, as it were, that are distinct from but intrinsic to God, right? Because under this sort of view, we have a kind of theistic conceptualism on which these abstract objects reside in God's mind. But then there are going to be just these necessary things that are distinct from but intrinsic to God, and that's going to violate divine simplicity. Under divine simplicity, at least the traditional doctrine, everything in God is identical to God. But that's not going to be able to be the case if there are infinitely many distinct, necessarily existent abstract objects existing as divine thoughts. If you say they're extrinsic to God by contrast, locating them outside of God and perhaps due to God's creative activity or something like that, well then God isn't free to refrain from creating anything, right? Because they're necessarily existent. And so God isn't free to refrain from creating them. And that, too, contradicts most traditional strands of classical theism. So there are problems distinctive to classical theism with respect to the postulation of abstract objects. There are also problems for non-classical theists, too. One might think that for non-classical theists, God's going to end up depending on abstracta, either for his existence or, more specifically, his character. So, for example, God's essential character might be due to something that isn't God, like the property of omniscience or the property of omnipotence. And one might think that that threatens God's ultimacy. Something about God is owed to something that isn't God himself. Instead, it's owed to these necessarily existent abstract properties. Now, again, there are ways to respond to these points. I'm not saying that these arguments succeed. I'm not saying that they refute theism. I'm not saying they pose insuperable challenges to theism or challenges that are all things considered cogent. Right? After all, for this last point, people might reject the view that properties ground the character of the things which instantiate the properties. They might actually think the direction of grounding or explanation goes the other way. It's precisely because something is brown that it instantiates the property brownness. And so it's not as though God's character would be due to or owed to the properties. Rather, God's character would come first, in the order of explanation. And it's only because God has that character that God instantiates the relevant properties. My point is simply that these worries can't be overlooked when you're offering arguments from abstracta for theism. And all too often, in fact, I think every single time that I've seen someone raise arguments from abstracta for theism, they almost always reliably ignore these at least potential and potentially serious difficulties that abstracta pose for theism. As I say here, there's serious concern that abstracta aren't smooth sailing for the theist. Again, check out my God and Abstract Objects playlist. And of course, check out my playlists more generally. They are oodles and oodles of fun. They're the best, believe me, folks. They are so great. All right, mistake number 58. Talking about the atheistic worldview, or the theistic worldview. Oh boy, it's a mistake to talk in these sorts of terms. A worldview is something like a system of beliefs or propositions that functions as a theory of everything. It's a comprehensive, descriptive, evaluative, and normative account of reality. In other words, it's basically just a systematic collection of claims that form someone's view or picture of the world and its various dimensions. Given this, clearly neither atheism nor theism are worldviews. Right? Instead, they are single propositions, namely the propositions no God exists and God exists, respectively. And since single propositions are obviously not whole systems of propositions that offer a comprehensive account of reality, it follows that atheism and theism are not worldviews. There is no such thing as the atheistic worldview. You can see here that many of these mistakes are inspired by Frank Turek. That's not an accident. All right, mistake number 59, treating atheism as identical with new atheism. No. Atheism is not new atheism. If you want to look into atheism, you should look into its best philosophical defenders. In particular, you need to be aware of some of the best contemporary or near-contemporary non-theistic philosophers. And I'll just give you a list for people to look into. You just look up their work online. Start reading it. It's cool. It's fun. It's great. Whether you're a theist, an atheist, or an agnostic. J.H. Sobel, Paul Draper, Graham Oppie, Richard Gale, J.L. Schellenberg, J.L. Mackey, William Rowe, Quentin Smith, Stephen Meitzen, Eric Wielenberg, Bede Rundle, Evan Fales, Wes Morriston, Gregory Dawes, Nicholas Everett, Nick Trakakis, Robin Lepetovan, Alex Malpass, Michael Martin, and Matt Dillahunty. Anyway, there are way more besides, and I'm leaving dozens off the list. Okay, fine. Maybe one of those is not like the other, but likewise, if you want to look into theism, you should look into the work of some of its best philosophical defenders, like Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, Robert Adams, Alexander Proust, Josh Rasmussen, Brian Leftow, Robin Collins, Eleanor Stump, Rob Coons, Daniel Howard Schneider, Nevin Klimenhaga, Daniel Rubio, Tyron Goldschmidt, Marilyn McCord Adams, Sam Liebens, Brian Cutter, Dustin Crummett, and way more besides. Again, I'm leaving dozens off the list, such as esteemed Professor Frank Turek. Esteemed Professor Dr. Frank Turek, Ph.D., All right, on to mistake number 60, lack theism. Okay, so this one is vexed. I'm going to be honest with you. This one is vexed. Unfortunately, one established usage of the term atheist among some linguistic communities is that of someone who lacks a belief in God. In light of the fact that this is one established usage among some linguistic communities, unfortunately, I do think it's then appropriate to proceed within such linguistic communities to treat atheists as all and only those who lack belief in God. I do regard it as unfortunate that the term atheist has come to have this established usage in some linguistic communities, mainly because it generates far more confusion and unclarity than the philosophers' usage of atheist to refer to anyone who believes that no gods exist. For some reasons to think that the philosophers' usage is clearer and more useful, at least along many dimensions, you can check out my videos here and here. Still, though, there's no denying that the term atheist has come to have lack theism as at least one established usage within some linguistic communities. And it's hard to tell those communities that they're, wrong to use the term in the way that they do, right? After all, words don't intrinsically have any meaning. They're just little squiggles or markings on a page, or just little patterns of electrical stimulation on a screen, right? They don't have any meaning in and of themselves intrinsically. Instead, people use words to mean things, right? If enough people in a given linguistic community across a large enough array of contexts and a large enough span of time use a word in a particular way, then, quite plausibly, that word has the relevant meaning associated with that usage. So it would simply be mistaken to try to say that those communities are quote-unquote wrong to use the word in that way. Still, and this point is why I include this as a mistake here, it can be pointed out that even though they aren't wrong or mistaken in using the word that way, their use of the word contributes a significant deal of confusion and unclarity, whereas a different use of the word doesn't. It's important to highlight confusion and unclarity where it exists, and it's good to make people aware that there are different uses for terms that are clearer and less apt to cause confusion. And again, for why the lack theist usage is apt to engender unclarity and confusion, see those two videos that I linked. I'm not going to get into that because it would add 30 to 45 minutes to an already excessively long video/series. Okay, mistake number 61. Lack theists, so people who merely lack a belief in God, or at least claim to merely lack a belief in God, comparing God to Santa, or the Easter Bunny, or leprechauns, or pixies, or fairies, etc. Yeah, right. Yeah, you merely lack a belief in God. Merely lack a belief in God. You don't positively believe God doesn't exist, but you compare God to things that we all believe don't exist, including you yourself, such as Santa, the Easter Bunny, leprechauns, pixies, fairies. I think you can clearly see a glaring inconsistency here. Alright, mistake number 62. One less God than you. We just go one God further. That kind of motto or slogan that you often hear among new atheists. One thing that I note here is that because I couldn't help myself, fewer should have been used instead of less here. Don't get me wrong, I often make grammatical mistakes in my speech and writing, so I'm a work in progress too. But if I see it in a slogan, I have to point it out. I'm sorry. See, look, here's a mistake right here. Right, the term God is a count noun. And the term fewer should be used with count nouns, whereas the term less should be used with mass nouns, right? You don't say you have fewer water. You say you have less water. You don't say I have less notebooks than you. Ugh, it hurts my ears. You have fewer notebooks. Anyway, that's a nitpick. That's not the mistake number 62. Okay, mistake. I'm going to explain why it's a mistake in a second. I just had to get that out of the way. Okay, I think the idea behind the slogan is the following. The new atheist employing it is presumably thinking something like this. Once the theist understands why they dismiss almost all the other gods that they don't believe in the case of the Christian theist, for instance, they dismiss the existence of Zeus, Thor, Allah, Vishnu, Krishna, theistic interpretations of Brahman, etc. Once the theist understands why they dismiss these gods, they'll then understand why the atheist dismisses theirs. And the atheist is really just imploring the theist to be consistent, right? The theist should simply be consistent by applying their standards concerning and reasons for dismissing the existence of other gods to their own God. And when they consistently do this, they'll find that they should give up their belief in their particular God. Okay, that's my best, most charitable interpretation of this slogan. Now, don't get me wrong. This is a reasonable point to bring up with some people. Primarily, people who haven't thought about why they believe in the particular God that they do. For these sorts of people, this challenge may very well be a good one, okay? The problem, though, is that this is really the only class of people for whom this challenge will stick. For everyone else who has considered and reasoned through why they believe the particular God that they do, they'll simply cite the reasons they have for believing their particular God and or disbelieving in the others. And the challenge at hand won't land for these sorts of people. And there are many considerations one might bring to bear on why one believes in a particular God while disbelieving in others. For example, many gods other than the one of traditional monotheism will be contingent, finite, limited beings, and so, per many cosmological arguments, would require an explanation in terms of a necessarily existent, infinite, unlimited being. I'm not saying that these cosmological arguments succeed, but my point is just that they can at least be wielded by the theist, right? The theist might think that they succeed, and the slogan does nothing to cast these sorts of arguments into doubt. So in this sort of case, right, these contingent, finite, limited beings, these many gods, they wouldn't really seem to deserve the appellation God. Like, they wouldn't have the kind of ultimacy characteristic of the divine. They would really just be a cool kind of creature. Moreover, there's ample reason to think that many such gods don't exist. For instance, if the gods of Olympus, as described by the relevant Greek myths, existed, we would expect to find them living atop Mount Olympus. But, of course, we don't. Yes, I recognize one can always propose ad hoc auxiliary hypotheses to save such views from refutation. For instance, one could propose that they turn invisible and undetectable exactly when any humans scale Mount Olympus. But these auxiliaries only serve to make the core hypotheses overwhelmingly less modest, less simple, they reduce their explanatory power, and more besides. In other words, such auxiliary hypotheses make the views in question even less believable. Another example of an argument favoring a particular god, in this case the Christian god specifically, would be arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I'm not here saying that these arguments succeed. Let me repeat that. I am not here saying that these arguments succeed. My point is that they're out there, right? And also that they're not even touched by the one god further or one less god, rather one fewer god, slogan/challenge. Okay, on to mistake number 63, extreme sloppiness in characterizing agnostics. This one gets my eyes rolling out of my eyeball sockets. So, straight out of the gate, here's philosophers' favored characterization of agnosticism. Whenever we consider any proposition P, whether it's the proposition that 1 + 1 = 2, the proposition that God exists, the proposition that there are stars, the proposition that there's an even number of stars, whenever we consider any proposition P, we can either believe P or not believe P, okay? Among those who don't believe P, there are those who believe that P is false, that is, who disbelieve P. They actively disbelieve P. They think it's false, on the one hand. And then there are those who don't believe that P is false. We therefore have three groups of people for any proposition P, right? Those who believe P, those who believe the negation of P, that is, those who believe that P is false, they disbelieve P, and then those who neither believe P, nor believe the negation of P. It's that third category, which are the agnostics with respect to P, right? They don't believe that P is true, but they also don't believe that P is false. Instead, they suspend judgment on P, right? They neither believe it, nor do they disbelieve it. They suspend or withhold judgment on the matter. Applying this to the case of God's existence, and as philosophers use these terms, those who believe the proposition that some God exists are the theists. Those who believe that no gods exist are the atheists, and those who've considered God's existence, but neither believe that some God exists, nor believe that no gods exist, are the agnostics. Graham Oppy offers a helpful addition here, which is those who haven't even considered God's existence, such as babies, and Graham Oppy calls those innocents. So we got those who haven't even considered the proposition, but among those who've considered it, right, you either believe it, you disbelieve it, or you neither believe nor disbelieve it. And those, respectively, are the theists, the atheists, and the agnostics. Notice that this is a super clean, super precise, super clear, and therefore super helpful carving up of the doxastic landscape, right? Doxa means belief, that's Greek. This is why philosophers favor these characterizations. It's super clean, super precise, super helpful, not prone to confusion. Now, note that we're all agnostics about lots of things, right? So agnosticism is always agnosticism towards a given proposition. Oftentimes people speak of agnosticism simpliciter, but that's usually because you're in a context wherein the relevant proposition towards which one is agnostic is understood by all parties, and so you just simplify it as agnostic or agnosticism. But notice that we're all agnostics about lots of things. So for instance, consider the claim that the number of stars in the observable universe is even. Now, if you're sensible, you don't believe that this claim is true, right? But you also don't believe that it's false, right? Instead, you suspend judgment on it, right? Like you withhold belief in it and its negation. You are, in other words, agnostic concerning the evenness of the number of stars in the observable universe. Now, note too that there are different underlying reasons why someone might suspend judgment or withhold belief about a particular matter, and none of these should be conflated with the mere fact of suspending judgment or withholding belief. Right, again, agnostics are those who suspend judgment or withhold belief about a particular matter. They neither believe it nor do they disbelieve it. That's all that it is to be an agnostic. Now, there are many different reasons why one might suspend judgment or withhold belief. None of these are to be conflated with agnosticism. And you shouldn't assume that an agnostic automatically falls into one of these categories specifically. So they might think that it's impossible to know either way, so whether it's possible to know whether or not P is true, and so they conclude that suspension of judgment is the appropriate doxastic attitude to take to the question. Like maybe it's impossible in principle to know the thing in question, maybe it's impossible in practice to know the thing in question, maybe it's impossible to know given our current evidence, etc. These are all different claims. Alternatively, they might think it's impossible to justifiably believe either way, and so suspension of judgment is the appropriate doxastic attitude. Again, maybe they think it's impossible in principle to justifiably believe either way, maybe they think only in practice, maybe they think that's impossible only given our current evidence, etc. Alternatively, they might think that while the truth is possible to know, or at least justifiably believe, they personally lack good reasons for favoring P over not P, and vice versa, right? So they just personally lack good reasons. They haven't come across, they're not aware of good reasons. Maybe they've looked at them, but they don't think that there are any good reasons. They just currently lack good reasons for favoring the claim over its negation, and moreover for favoring the negation over the claim. And as a result, they suspend judgment on the matter. Alternatively, they might think that while the truth is possible to know or justifiably believe, everyone currently lacks good reason for favoring P over not P, and vice versa. So they might think that there are literally no good reasons whatsoever favoring P over not P, or not P over P, and that's not just the case for they themselves, right, their own personal stock of reasons, but everyone's stock of reasons. No one has good reason for thinking one way or the other. That's another reason why they might suspend judgment. Alternatively, they might say that while the truth is possible to know or justifiably believe, they might say that they currently have good reasons for favoring P over not P, but they also have good reasons for favoring not P over P, and that these reasons roughly counterbalance, or maybe it's simply not clear which reasons are stronger, and so on down the list. So look, there are so many different reasons why someone might suspend judgment or withhold a belief about a particular matter. So much confusion results from conflating all these sorts of things. Sometimes these things down here will be conflated with one another, but moreover, and perhaps more often, I've seen people conflate mere suspension of judgment or suspension of belief, that is agnosticism, with one or more of these particular reasons why people might suspend judgment or withhold belief. Do not do that. So then, here are some bad construals of agnosticism with respect to God's existence. These are not good characterizations of agnosticism. Someone who doesn't know whether or not God exists. Some of these might be necessary conditions for being agnostics. But my point is just that this is not how agnostics should be defined, right? So, I mean, of course, if agnostic suspends judgment on whether or not God exists, well, then clearly they don't know whether or not God exists. But the point is that an agnostic is not equivalent to someone who doesn't know whether or not God exists. After all, when someone claims that God exists and another claims that God doesn't exist, one of them is wrong. But neither of them is an agnostic on the question of God's existence. So one of them doesn't know whether or not God exists, but they don't count as an agnostic. So my point here isn't that none of these are necessary conditions on being agnostics. My point is just that they're not like necessary and sufficient conditions which provide the definition of agnosticism. Okay, anyway, so do not construe agnostics with respect to God's existence as any of the following. Don't identify agnosticism with any of these. So, someone who doesn't know whether or not God exists, someone who takes themselves not to know whether or not God exists, someone who can't know whether or not God exists, someone who takes themselves to be unable to know whether or not God exists, someone who takes no one to know whether or not God exists, someone who takes no one to be able to know whether or not God exists, someone who thinks that there aren't good reasons for favoring theism over atheism or atheism over theism, someone who thinks that there are good reasons for favoring theism over atheism, but that there are also good reasons for favoring atheism over theism, and that these either counterbalance or else it's not clear which outweighs the other, etc. A major problem with each of these characterizations is that they cross-cut beliefs. For instance, in principle, one can believe God exists and so be a theist and so not be an agnostic, but also not know whether or not God exists. Say, because God doesn't in fact exist, and so this person neither knows God exists nor knows God doesn't exist. The same point could be wrong with someone who believes God doesn't exist, but where God does in fact exist. And this problem for cross-cutting beliefs on the matter will afflict basically each of these bad characterizations of agnosticism about God's existence. So all of this is in the hopes of dispelling the mountains of confusion that I have seen on the internet with respect to characterizing agnostics. And finally, note that the relationship between credence agnosticism is complicated. One can be an agnostic about P while assigning no precise credence to P. Or one can be an agnostic about P and assign an interval of credence to P. So, for example, maybe from 40% to 60%, that is 0.4 to 0.6. Or one can be agnostic about P and assign a precise credence to P, say 0.5, or maybe 0.45, or 0.55, or something thereabout. Assuming that if your credence in God's existence is 0.55, then you don't believe that God exists. You just only, ever so slightly think it's more likely than not that God exists, but you don't full-blown believe that God exists. So don't think that someone must have a credence in a proposition of exactly 0.5 to be an agnostic about that proposition. That's yet another mistake that I want to dispel here. Okay, so I'm off my high horse. I see this sloppiness time and time and time and time and time again. So it's time to put an end to that. Mistake number 64, there are no agnostics. Are there really agnostics? One of the central arguments is what I'll call the argument from acting as if. This argument would essentially go something like, well, I mean, listen, there are two options. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. You sort of act out your beliefs, and so you're either acting as if God exists. You're going to church, you're praying, you're doing these things, or you're acting as if God doesn't exist, right? You're just living your life without going to church, without doing those things, right? And so there's really no third option. There's no room for being an agnostic here. I don't find this convincing. First of all, I mean, acting as if P does not entail that one believes P, and hence it's perfectly compatible for there to be agnostics, even though they may act as though theism or atheism is true, right? But I think secondly, and more importantly, I do think that this is missing a third option. There is a distinctly third option, which is acting as if agnosticism is rational or the correct epistemic choice, given one's position on the epistemic landscape. That is to say, one would be seeking with all one's might, with all one's power, with every fiber of one's being, right, for some ultimate reality, right, that maybe you don't even know exists. You might occasionally say prayers like, God, if you exist, please help me discover you and serve you, something like that. Or reading both theist and atheist literature with painstaking care and so on, right? I mean, all of these seem to be characteristically agnostic ways of acting. And so it does seem to me that it's a false dichotomy. You can act as if atheism is true. You can act as if theism is true, or you can act as if you genuinely don't know either way. That argument does not seem plausible to my mind. If you're looking for further reading on this, definitely check out Dr. Paul Draper's Seeking But Not Believing, Confessions of a Practicing Agnostic. And Paul Draper is from Purdue University, so boiler up there. All right, on to mistake number 65. Haha, atheists are so addicted to talking about God. I wonder why that is. This is a painful mistake. I see this quite often, and we're going to listen to at least significant chunks of this video from Non-Alchemist explaining why this is a mistake.
In this video, I'm going to give a few reasons why deconverts tend to remain active in conversations about Christianity, or even resort to activism against it. Then I'll offer some reflections. First, there may be a bit of righteous indignation. Though not a prominent motivation for all of us, it can certainly be a powerful driving force for some. And frankly, Christians typically have no one to blame for this but themselves. Apostates often feel lied to, because the faith was presented as if it were so obviously true that no rational person could deny it, and the views of others were consistently articulated to them in the worst possible light. Don't be surprised when this backfires. Second, interest in the issues themselves can also be a big factor. Look, many of us have poured our lives into studying and defending what we used to believe, and thus have a genuine affinity for these topics. We simply enjoy talking about them, and have a desire to participate in these conversations wherever they may be found. Third, many of us operate under the assumption that most people would want to know if they have false beliefs. I know I would. So once we come to the conclusion that our views were dead wrong on such important topics, we naturally feel obligated to share why we believe that. Treat others as you would want to be treated. Am I right? Finally, we want to make the world a better place, so far as we understand what that means. Many of us truly believe we're helping you by challenging your religious beliefs, and helping society as a whole by opposing the political excess that characterizes much of Christianity, especially in America. This is where skeptics aren't always on the same page. Some want to totally eradicate Christianity because they think it's essentially harmful, while others, like me, are more concerned with combating fundamentalist ways of viewing Christianity. Either way, our actions are usually born out of a concern for the common good, and a real desire to help the people in our lives. Now for a few thoughts. To those non-religious people watching who lean more on the activist side, of which I am one of the things I've noticed is that mockery and a sharp tongue are commonplace in these discussions. I don't have a problem with this in principle, but I've noticed that some of the people relying on this strategy don't know what the they're talking about. If you want to make a difference, you really need to ask yourself, do you know enough about this stuff to make your criticism sting? Will average and intelligent believers alike shift uncomfortably in their chair at the weight of your words? Because I can tell you, if you're speaking as if an anthology of texts written over thousands of years with multiple genres is literally equivalent to Harry Potter, or if your main strategy is to point and shout, "You believe in Sky, Daddy," you're not being as effective as you think you are. What we need is to be better as a whole when it comes to not letting religious people off the hook so easily. Any mistake you make will be used as a reason not to take you seriously by some Christians. What this means is that if you're talking about topics related to the Bible, you should probably be at least somewhat familiar with biblical studies. If you're talking about things related to philosophy, like any argument for God inevitably is, you should probably be at least somewhat familiar with philosophy. But that's the end of my little side rant about my tribe. If you're a Christian and don't like us being vocal, get over it and get used to it.
So, in short, the reason why many atheists are so addicted to talking about God is because, firstly, they find these questions incredibly interesting. It's just super fascinating to think about these arguments for and against God's existence. And it's perfectly fine for them to follow what they're super passionate about, what they're interested in. Secondly, these things are deeply valuable. It's just valuable to think about the fundamental nature of reality and to discuss it with fellow interlocutors trying to get to the truth of the matter. And thirdly, it's a deeply significant question. And significance invites caring about the object of significance. There's lots at stake. In a lot of places, atheists are deeply marginalized. In lots of places, atheists are stripped of pretty basic human rights. In a lot of places, theism and theistic arguments and apologetics are wielded on behalf of negative purposes, for instance, negative political purposes. And in light of this, it makes perfect sense to talk about God quite a lot, and talk about apologetics, and talk about these arguments, and talk about religion, etc. So the fact that these questions are deeply interesting, that it's deeply valuable to think about them, and reflect on them, and to discuss with others about them, and to get to the truth of the matter about them, and finally the fact that they're significant, they have lots of deep and interesting ramifications, including practical ramifications for one's own life, and the life of societies at large, all that makes it perfectly intelligible why many atheists are quote-unquote addicted to talking about God. It's not as though they, secretly hate God, or, All right, mistake number 66. Agnostics are just fence-sitters. Or agnostics are cowards. I've heard that one as well. It's so funny. This is simply not so. Suspension of judgment is a considered position, and will often involve taking tons of stands on most arguments. Right? That's what I do all day long on my channel. I take stands on arguments. I argue for different theses. I argue against different theses. My whole channel is like an extended investigation into philosophical argumentation. So, of course, one could be an agnostic because they don't think that there are reasons favoring either theism or atheism. But one could also be an agnostic because they see lots of reasons favoring each of theism and atheism, and judge that the reasons either roughly counterbalance, or that it's not clear which way the balance of reasons points. And, of course, if you haven't noticed, I take lots of stands on lots of philosophical questions and arguments pertaining to God. This reminds me of a comment that I once saw on my channel. I forget how long ago it was. Seems like Joe has mastered the fence writing act. This person says, in general, theists are of a nicer disposition, and so Joe can make more videos against their views without getting them upset. In general, atheists are a lot more rude as disposition, so Joe must be more careful about the number of shots he takes at atheism so he doesn't have to feel their wrath. Seems like a man lacking courage and wanting everyone to like him. In general, agnosticism is just a safe position, which allows one to be in good standing with both parties. Whether that is Joe's motivation or not, one has to admit that it's the easiest and most comfortable position to be in regarding YouTube philosophy of religion. One can reap the praises and support of both camps while incurring little criticism or condemnation. So what I said in response is, theists don't seem to be of a nicer disposition, at least in my experience. I didn't know where this person was getting that. Just witness any of my videos, critical of theistic arguments, wherein there are tons of theists making very critical comments in which I routinely respond to and engage. As for shots at atheists, most of internet atheism is confused and not worth engaging, whereas internet theism, in particular much of internet apologetics, has allied with philosophy of religion, an area in which I specialize, and has misused it, misapplied it, or made mistakes in it. That's why I address internet theism more often. It's generally of higher quality by dint of allying with philosophy of religion, but still mistaken as it's being wielded on behalf of apologetic purposes. Plus, my professional research interests in philosophy of religion are mostly on theistic arguments. Specifically, I've published extensively on cosmological arguments, including the Kalam, contingency, and Thomistic arguments, ontological arguments, and models of God. Since I'm not convinced by those arguments, which are at the centerpiece of my professional research, my videos, which reflect my research naturally enough, are mostly critical of theistic arguments. This is also why you almost never see me make videos on things like teleological arguments, the problem of evil, with my semi-recent response to Trent Horn being an exception to that one, as well as my video on skeptical theism with Perry Hendricks being an exception. You'll also almost never see me make videos on divine hiddenness, and so on. Whereas, notice, my playlists on the Kalam, contingency, Thomistic arguments from change, existential inertia, classical theism, and so on are chock full. It's not very hard to see an obvious pattern here. My videos reflect my professional research, which, in the case of my philosophy of religion research, apart from my metaphysics and philosophy of religion and metaethics and whatnot, is on specific theistic arguments and models of God. Okay? As for dodging criticism, I don't know what world this person lives in. Go to almost any comment sections of my videos and you'll find tons of criticisms from theists and atheists alike that I routinely engage. I find agnosticism personally to be actually the worst position in terms of criticism. Instead of creating an echo chamber like almost all atheist and theist channels do, I attract a wide audience with lots of backgrounds, and I have no agenda to confirm anyone's pre-existing beliefs, which leads to significant criticism from all sides. This is why my comment sections are routinely fraught with criticisms from both theists and atheists, and which I routinely engage and respond to. And just as I say here, this person just seems unaware of these obvious facts about my criticisms, about my comment sections routinely drawing criticisms, which I actually routinely also engage and respond to. I also actively publish in these areas, making my work openly amenable to public criticism, and I've received a lot. See my blog, on which I respond to a deluge of criticisms. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. Deluge, something like that. Why did I write that? And I end this by saying that what's cowardly is not what I'm doing. What's cowardly is building an echo chamber, alienating the other side, and confirming the beliefs of those held captive in the echo chamber. And I've done everything in my power to make my channel the precise opposite of that, which is partly why both theists and atheists fill my comment sections, and why I receive tons of criticism from both, and why I appreciate them both coming on and listening to my content. So there's nothing fence-sitting about being agnostic. There's nothing cowardly in it. And again, as I said, I take stands on almost all arguments that I come across, so certainly doesn't involve just fence-sitting. All right, mistake number 67, overlooking the panoply of atheistic worldviews on offer. Notice that I'm not saying here that atheism is a worldview. I'm talking about atheistic worldviews, that is, worldviews which include atheism as a component, okay? So mistake number 67 is overlooking the panoply of atheistic worldviews on offer and instead thinking that atheism implies a particular worldview, say a highly reductionistic or even eliminativist naturalism, or else that there's only one or a couple atheistic worldviews on offer. But here at least, I just wanted to emphasize that there are so many different worldviews that could include atheism as a constituent. There's Oppian naturalism, there's Felipe Leon's liberal atheistic naturalism, there's atheistic Buddhism, there's atheistic Hinduism, there's atheistic Neoplatonism with an impersonally construed Neoplatonic one at reality's foundation. There's Eric Steinhardt's atheistic Platonism, there's an Aristotelian-like worldview incorporating an atheistically construed Thomistic being itself at reality's foundation. There's David Lewis's systematic atheistic picture of reality as a vast sea of concrete possible worlds, each of which is a vast human mosaic of individual intrinsic qualities. There's Draper's naturalism, there's atheistic axiarchism, and atheistic views which include Thomas Nagel's natural teleology and whatnot, and so on down the list. And this kind of goes back to a mistake that was in part 1 of the series as well, which is like a binary attitude. People way too often think that it's either like materialism or like theism. No! Or like that it's only like one very narrow strand of naturalism or theism. No, stop. Okay, mistake number 68. Atheism is a religion. No, atheism, at least as philosophers understand it, is a proposition, or a view. Namely the proposition that no gods exist. It's painfully clear that a mere proposition is not a religion. Simplifying a bit, or rather simplifying quite a lot, and being very rough, religion is something like a system of practices, beliefs, rituals, etc., revolving around something of ultimate concern, for example a god or a karmic cycle, and which involves various costly commitments on the part of its adherents, for example costly commitments in terms of time, attention, prayer, worship, good works, almsgiving, etc. Atheism is not a system of beliefs, practices, rituals, etc. It's a mere proposition, okay? Atheism also doesn't involve various costly commitments. Atheism just isn't a religion. Please stop. Also, what's ironic about this is when people try to say atheism is religion, they're kind of like doing it as if it's like a shot at atheism. It's as if they're kind of granting that like it's a negative to be a religion. But anyway, gone to mistake number 69. Nice. You can't have libertarian free will under atheism or naturalism. So, firstly, this is usually just asserted. I've seen so many people just flatly assert this with no justification whatsoever. And I ask, why? Why think that? You can easily have irreducible substance-level causal powers under atheism. Nothing in the mere denial of God's existence forces you to deny that there are irreducible substance-level causal powers, had by, for instance, libertarianly free agents. You can also have indeterministic causal processes under naturalism that percolate up to the level of neural networks, thereby allowing for leeway in choosing among possible courses of action. Among many others who have done the same, Robert Kane, who's among the most prominent philosophers working on free will, has defended a model of precisely this sort of naturalistic libertarianism. Again, I'm not here to say that this view is viable or that it succeeds or what have you. My point is that this is not something that, like, an atheist by dint of being an atheist or a naturalist by dint of being a naturalist is prevented from saying. They can at least consistently defend such a view. And atheism and naturalism is at least consistent with it. Indeed, so as to ensure that the non-naturalist's view is scientifically respectable and doesn't involve constant violations of the laws of nature, the libertarian non-naturalist, too, will be committed to precisely this sort of percolation of indeterminism up to the level of neural networks, right? If they don't grant this, that is, if they think that the physical world is fully deterministic, then they have to admit that very precise miracles or violations of physical law occur every single time anyone makes a free choice. And that's just not very plausible, one might think, at least at first glance. So the libertarian non-naturalist will also have to develop accounts on which physical indeterminism can underwrite free action. And in that case, the naturalist can simply co-opt that very account for their own purposes. So overall, I think it's generally just kind of lame when people say you can't have libertarian free will under atheism and also under naturalism, and especially under atheism, specifically keeping in mind that you can be an atheist and a non-naturalist. Alright, mistake number 70. Theists are irrational, or atheists are irrational. I covered this in my response to Trent Horn, but I wanted to keep this as a mistake in its own right. Whether someone is rational in believing something is a function of a huge concoction of individual specific factors, including their particular background web of beliefs, the books they've read, the papers they've read, the videos they've watched, the podcasts they've listened to, the order in which they've read and listened to these things, the experiences they've had, their precise body of testimonial evidence, their plausibility structures or their intuitions, and countless other factors besides. This individual-specific mixture of factors situates each of us in a unique position on the grand epistemic landscape, equipping each of us with unique, sometimes incommunicable reasons for our beliefs. This, too, is how disagreeing parties can each be rational, at least very often. The parties are coming equipped with different lenses through which they see the issue, different background reasons, and more besides. It's trivially easy to find people whose unique concoction of the aforementioned factors renders it rational for them to believe in God. And it's likewise trivially easy to find people whose unique concoction of the aforementioned factors renders it rational for them to disbelieve in God. This is partly why intellectual empathy is so important. It helps you to at least approximately see things from others' perspectives and to appreciate the other person's rationality. In turn, this helps facilitate the productive, love-oriented exchange of ideas among disagreeing parties. So anyway, all of this is to say that one can definitely be rational in being a theist, just as one can definitely be rational in being an atheist. But moving on to mistake number 71, atheists use their free will to deny God's existence. This is not very plausible, at least for many atheists. Even assuming we have free will, we generally don't have direct control over the formation of our beliefs. You can't, for instance, just will to disbelieve in Australia, or just choose to believe that the number of stars in the observable universe is even, or just choose to believe that Krishna exists. No. Instead, and again in general, we simply find ourselves being convinced of things based on our experiences, seemings, testimonial evidence, and whatnot. Of course, we can often indirectly influence our beliefs by choosing what to read, what resources to gather, who to talk to, and things like that. But even then, your epistemic response to those resources is, in general, something that seems to happen to you, not something that you actively, intentionally, and directly control. Alright, mistake number 72. Theism entails some traditional monotheistic religion. Both atheists and theists can make this mistake, at least in my experience. In some contexts, some theists will assert that if God exists, then some traditional monotheistic religion must be true. But note that this sort of claim needs an argument, right? It isn't immediately obvious, and bare non-religious philosophical theism is a respectable view in epistemic space. Also, in some contexts, some atheists will take arguments against the world's major religions as arguments that also automatically rule out theism. But again, that isn't necessarily right. One would also have to rule out bare, non-religious philosophical theism in order to run this sort of argument, and the aforementioned atheists oftentimes overlook this. So, in short, don't overlook the epistemic possibility that theism could be true, even though no traditional monotheistic religion is true. Alright, and that does it for part 2 of this 7-part series on common mistakes in philosophy and religion. Again, this one was about theism, atheism, naturalism, agnosticism, theists, atheists, naturalists, agnostics, etc. As a reminder, part 3, the next part in the series, is going to be on the Kalam and contingency arguments, common mistakes pertaining to those, so stay tuned for that. If you enjoy this content, please smash that like button and leave a comment with your thoughts on the video. It really does help the algorithm, and I really do appreciate that. We want to spread the good news of the majesty of reason. If you enjoy my content more generally, please consider supporting me on Patreon or making a one-time donation. Literally any amount helps. Truly helps me through grad school, and it is so much appreciated. You guys are the wind in my sails, and so much love to all y'all who are already supporting. Most importantly, if you see someone make these mistakes, send this video to them. For instance, you could just type into your email Frank Turek and be like, hey, you've committed like literally every single one of these mistakes. No, I'm not telling you guys to send hundreds of emails in total to Frank Turek. But anyway, I need to end before I get myself in trouble. Thank you guys kindly for the view, and what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid, this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.